Welcome to Entering the Void. My name is Mark Bind from Wayo Talks, and I'm looking forward to continuing our discussion with Dr. Yvette De Villiers. In the first episode, we spoke about astrology and astronomy, particularly how it related to the year 2020. In our second episode, we discussed the Photon Belt and the implications thereof. In this episode, we move towards metaphysical philosophy, and we're going to begin this discussion by exploring the self and the shift. Yvette, how do you actually define the self?
Mark, I always talk to people about a tree. So I always say to them, imagine yourself as a tree. You have your roots, which is your ego-based consciousness, which is currently manifested in this physical reality. Then you have your trunk, which is your awareness of self. And then you'll have your higher self, which in our interview I described as the part of us that knows. And this is the part of your consciousness that's actually in a higher reality or a dimension higher or deeper than the physical reality that we are currently in. What I would like to do to sort of simplify the explanation is to first just talk a little bit about the ego consciousness, about the ego itself and its purpose.
Yeah. Okay.
And then talk about the higher consciousness, the higher self and its purpose. And then the disconnect and the reconnect between these two.
Yeah, I think, a lot is said about the ego, and I suspect there's a lot of misunderstanding about what the ego is. Can you perhaps explain that a bit further for us?
Yes, I think that when sort of awareness of this nature of consciousness came about, or sort of in the 60s and 70s, there was definitely a lot of vilifying of the ego, and to sort of be in ego is a bad thing, and to be ego-based is a bad thing. And I think definitely a goal for me in our podcast today is just to clear a little bit of that up. The ego is actually the part of our psyche that is in charge of our survival. So because we have an ego, we don't die from exposure. We don't walk into a fire. We don't sort of just immerse ourselves in water. It's the part of our awareness that keeps us safe. And it's a very important part of our awareness. Yeah. And it's a part of us that allows us to survive in physical, biological bodies. In our current reality, which is Earth. So there's nothing bad about it. There's nothing negative about it. But the problem comes in, if you can recall in our previous discussions, when we were in deep space. So in our sort of tour around our star, our 26,000-year tour around our star, at the place where we are in the deepest space, so the deepest removed from the photon belt, the furthest removed, about 5,000 years ago now. Our oscillation frequency is very low and our coherence is very low. And what happened there is there then became a disconnect upon incarnation between the ego self, which is survival based, and the higher self, which wants to learn and grow through the method of an incarnation. So is this like the leaves of the tree are disconnected from the roots? So correct. Perhaps the trunk has shrunk down and that connection is just much weakened. It's much weakened, and it's not it doesn't happen properly anymore because the oscillation frequency and coherence of the higher self is quite high. And then the survival based frequencies and coherence of the ego is quite low. And for these two to come together, there needs to be an environment that is conducive to that. And our environment that far away from the photon belt does not seem to be conducive of that connection staying intact. Yeah. So tell us a bit more about higher self. So the higher self is the part of us that wants to learn and grow through the experience of a physical incarnation on Earth. I think it's worth noting that from what we know in metaphysical philosophy, it's a huge effort to actually orchestrate an incarnation and then maintain that incarnation is a massive effort on behalf of the higher self. Well, I'm sure a lot of people resonate with that. Being on Earth feels like a lot of effort. It feels like a lot of effort, but it's more complicated than that, Mark. And I would like to share a personal experience with you. And I think it's important that I do, because metaphysical philosophy can become very abstract very quickly. So I've actually got a few personal experiences to share in these next two podcasts.
Oh, great.
Just to make it more relatable.
Yeah.
And this question of why being incarnate is traumatic is something that has plagued me for all of my life. I can remember as a child, upon waking, being completely sort of distracted, distraught even, taking anything from half an hour to 2 hours to what my mother at the time called surface, where you sort of couldn't touch me or talk to me. It was very difficult for me to transition from sleep into waking time all throughout my life as a child, and certainly as an adult as well, although I've become more addicted. And this issue had been bothering me for all my life. So last year, in March 2020, when it became apparent that we were going to be spending a prolonged period of time at home and in lockdown, I initially closed the practice for the first 5 weeks because we thought that was all that it would be at the time. And I set a goal for myself that I would like to have a dream that explains this to me. So that explains, and at that point in time, my own incarnational trauma to me. What was very interesting is it took about 9 weeks to have that dream. So it took about 9 weeks of virtual isolation on my own on the farm where I live in the winelands, to actually become calm enough and quiet enough and clear enough to be able to extract this wisdom from what I believe to be my higher consciousness. And I'm just going to explain the dream to you, or relate the dream to you in short. So I dreamt that I was walking through the mountains. It was the Friendship Pass, where you sort of gradually come out the other side. I met up with a group of people who told me that they are on their way to a camp. I said to them that I want to join them, and then when I've sort of accompanied them there, I'm going to be on my way. It was agreed. Ended up in this camp. And started feeling quite disorientated and as if I didn't know where I belong. Everybody was going about their business. I felt out of sorts. I felt I didn't know where my things were. I eventually asked somebody working in a cafeteria in this camp to please just tell me where I am and what I'm doing there. Nobody knew what I was talking about. And eventually a lady actually looked up and said to me, I recognize you. And she called me by my name, which I at that moment in the dream recognized as a name from a previous time that I was here. And this was completely shocking and devastating to me because I realized that I had reincarnated into this space. I then stood on a sort of a rise in this dream and I looked at the camp and water was rising up. And it basically covered everything in the camp. This lady that had recognized me then came and stood next to me and said to me, yes, you know, this happens every day. The water comes, it immerses everything. It basically washes the whole camp away, and tomorrow morning you have to start over again. At which time I then woke up. I knew it was the dream. I knew it was the dream that I'd been asking for. And I set about the next couple of weeks to sort of analyze and understand what it was that I'd been told. And I came to the conclusion that this is incarnation. I definitely felt that I had tricked myself into this incarnation. I definitely felt that I would maybe not have come of my own volition. I felt that there was a higher sort of element of my psyche that had tricked myself into coming, and I felt angry about that. So it was about witnessing and acknowledging that anger and working through it. And then I also came to the conclusion that this rising of the water, which in metaphysical philosophy symbolizes the subconscious, so oceans, water, bodies of water symbolize the subconscious, and then the washing away of everything and then having to start the next day over again, for me had the symbology of the trauma that happens to the ego in our current state of being without the connection to the higher self. And for me, what I concluded from that was that I don't think this is how it is meant to be. I think that our connection to our higher self actually needs to be maintained, integrated and maintained, so that during sleep we can transition into the state of higher coherence that part of us that knows actually resides in. And that we are in fact meant to spend our sleeping hours in that state of being, resting, recovering, and making sense of our experience on Earth. And then coming back into wakefulness in the morning, restored and ready for a next day of learning. And I think that certainly for myself up to that point, and for a lot of us, that isn't actually the case.
Well, it seems that very few people live in connection with their higher selves, and I'd say even fewer people even know of the existence of the higher self.
Yes, Mark, and I think that is why life on Earth is so traumatic for us. Because I think currently in our sleeping state, our ego just tries to make sense of the trauma of the day. If you speak to people, and certainly in the practice I speak to a lot of people who reiterate traumatic and even terrifying night experiences. And when we break it down, it's literally trying to make sense of things that they'd experienced on Earth in what we call unawakened state, or without the reality of there being something better. So I came to the conclusion that in our current state, without this actively integrated, maintained connection to our higher awareness, we basically live in a state of perpetual trauma, because we experience life from the survival-based state, and then we sleep at night and we try and make sense of that in time for the next day's survival-based state.
So our entire existence is within the ego state of trying to survive.
That's right. And I think that for who we are in our nature of our consciousness as universal beings, I think that is extremely traumatic. I think it's the reason we age. I think it's the reason we get sick. And I think it's one of the big reasons we actually die prematurely. We know that in our as biological forms in our current environment, we could live up easily up to 120 years of age.
Yeah.
But we don't. And I think that this sort of perpetual state of trauma that our psyche is in, without this connection to the part of us that knows, or our higher consciousness, is a hugely contributing factor to that.
Yeah. What needs to happen to shift this?
So the higher self, the part of us that knows, only wants to reconnect with the self and with the ego self. And it will try anything and everything to make this reconnection happen. And this is sort of just as a side note, just to give you a bit of background there. One of the big issues that I have with our current system of materialism and material-based security that we spoke about in the interview as well, that is sort of currently crumbling. And that is that it makes the ego feels safe in this world that it has created, and it negates the need for a connection with a higher self or a higher wisdom. So not only are you sitting with a situation where, with the connection to the higher self being cut off, which is the higher self being the CEO of the company, if you will, the two I see now being in charge, being the ego, which has survival as its goal. The two I see is also not interested in having the CEO back. And that to me is something that, with this introduction of materialism and the opportunity that it gives for a relative sense of safety in material wealth, or at least the striving there towards, actually dumps down the ego's sense of a need to actually be connected with the higher self. And so the higher self has to work very hard to try and get the ego's attention. And often what we then see is that it brings about a crisis. So 99% of the time when people come and see me in my private practice and want some advice, it's because they are in crisis. And it's because they are in a crisis the size of which they can no longer work out with their ego or with their ego-based consciousness. And I often hear them saying to me, I've tried everything. I've gone the medical route. I've put my business into business rescue. I've had relationship counseling. I've tried everything in that I know of to try and resolve my crisis and come into a state of comfort, and I'm just not getting there. And now I'm ready to look at a metaphysical solution, metaphysical being larger than physical. So this is what we see. We see the higher self going to extraordinary lengths by actually creating crisis, which shouldn't be a normal part of life. We shouldn't be living from crisis to crisis or from trauma to crisis. I think that part of what happens in our manifestations of our world is actually our higher self trying to reach us to facilitate the reconnect to a higher wisdom.
Yeah. So what can people do to create this reconnection between the higher self and the ego?
So our current evolutionary developmental trajectory, where most of us are dominated by our ego consciousness, which is this perpetual need for survival, ends in destruction. And the reason for that is because the ego consciousness is based in fear. As we said previously, this is actually a very natural thing, because without fear we won't survive. We die of exposure from not wearing clothing, we'd walk into fire, we wouldn't be afraid of snow or rain. So we need fear. But without the overriding wisdom of the higher self connection, the fear takes over and starts becoming the basis of our decision-making processes and our choices. I think you'd agree with me that if you have to speak to the decision makers when nations go to war, these people would say to you that they didn't feel they had a choice. They felt under threat and they didn't have a choice. And I think that is sort of the essence of it, because in order to overcome fear as a driving factor for our decisions and our actions, we actually have to reframe fear itself. And there's a very simple little exercise that I use for myself and that I recommend for my clients in the practice, which I'll take you through now. And I would actually recommend or invite our viewers to maybe give a try. And that is where you actually sit and you walk yourself through the worst that could happen when you are experiencing anxiety or fear. So you sort of say to yourself, okay, what is the worst that could possibly play out in this instance that I'm fearing or that I'm feeling anxious about? And you properly witness that and you properly acknowledge it. And then you ask yourself, how would I feel an hour after the event? How would I feel a day after the event? And how would I feel a week and then a month after the event? It's an incredibly powerful exercise to do, because it walks us through the worst possible case scenario and then walks us out the other side.
Yeah. So it's like facing your fear.
Exactly.
So a lot of people have a fear of public speaking. So say, for example, if they imagined being on stage and forgetting their lines, and they contemplate, well, what's the worst that would happen? They feel a bit embarrassed for a few days, perhaps, and they could just explore those feelings.
If they could explore those feelings, and interestingly enough, Mark, we actually recover quite quickly. And I've had a recent experience of that myself, where something that I've been fearing for months actually happened. It was traumatic. I did find my way through. I felt better the day after. I felt better the week after, and now about a couple of weeks later, I almost can't remember what happened. What I also do, especially when people suffer from anxiety, a lot of people specifically come and see me because they suffer from debilitating anxiety, is I take them through this exercise, and at that crux where the thing that they fear or feel anxious about is not happening, I ask them, will you die? And in a lot of the cases, the answer is no. And our fear is, in fact, a fear of death. The ego fears its own termination. And in a lot of cases, and this is part of what we'll get into when we do the 12 Steps to Mastery course, is mastering our fear. Understanding that for a lot of people, that activation of this worst case scenario is actually a technique of the ego to get adrenaline going, because they have adrenal burnout. And the ego knows that by activating this fear response, it's activating adrenaline and therefore ensuring survival. And that anxiety is actually a very protracted and interesting survival technique that people's psyche implements to keep them going. And often if I sort of explain that and get into that with people, we've got 50% of the anxiety sorted out there, just by understanding what is actually going on in your body and in your psyche.
Okay, what other exercises could people do to work more from their higher self?
So I call it active reconnection with the higher self. The higher self being the part of us that knows is also the part of us that has access to divine solutions. So divine solution is an answer that works for everyone. And personally, I think that they are the best solutions out there, because not only do you have your own problem solved, you also have the satisfaction of working towards a resolution that works for everyone. And the higher self, the part of us that knows, has these divine solutions. So there's a lot of incentive in working with active reconnection with the higher self. There's 3 ways in which we can do this. The first being meditation. So just sort of sitting in a state of calming the mind, of letting thoughts run out. We'll get into that in the 12 Steps to Mastery as well, as how to meditate effectively and how to use creative visualization to create our world. The second is time in nature. And there I again have a very personal experience to reiterate, which is my time recently in Makaranga Gardens, at Makaranga Garden Lodge in KwaZulu-Natal. I've been visiting the lodge, which is owned by a very, very dear friend of mine for about 15 years. And it's a lodge situated in a botanical garden, of which I've brought some slides along, which we'll also look at just to give you a sense of the atmosphere. The vegetation is lush, the bird life is ample. You can literally go into this garden and immerse yourself in nature. And I felt very depleted after COVID. I felt my life energy was very low. I had quite a lot of anxiety around how long it's going to continue, when I would be able to go back to full-time work, what that would look like. And I also felt that my fight against this virus had actually drained my life energy. And spending time in the garden, I could literally feel day by day how I was getting better and how I was reconnecting through what I believe to be my coherence increasing and also my oscillation frequency going up, increasing. And that basically comes from nature being perfect. I don't know if you're aware of the Fibonacci principle or the golden mean, which is the ratios in the development of a plant or a shell or a flower, and that ratio being perfectly balanced. And I believe we take that in when we're in nature. I believe that our eye sees it and starts to reorganize ourselves, our own internal balance accordingly. And that's actually true for any nature. You don't have to go and spend your time in a huge lush garden like this. You can sit under a tree. You can sit in your own garden. So that's an immediate place where this connection to the higher consciousness can happen due to an increase in our coherence in our thoughts and our oscillation frequency of the subatomic matter in our system.
Yeah. And you've also spoken about the oscillation frequency of the sounds of nature being higher than the average for humanity.
Yes, definitely that. And then also asking for connection. It's such a simple thing, but if we actually sit in a natural environment, we still our thoughts, and we set the intention of reconnecting with a part of us that knows, that is huge. I often say to people, it's like imagining yourself in a room and knocking on the wall in the hope that there's somebody on the other side that will knock back. And then, imagine your surprise when that actually happens. We'll also go into that a little bit later on as to how to get our system clear enough. At the end of the next podcast, I'll give an exercise there on how to actually do a very specific meditation of clearing our energy, raising our coherence, and then connecting with the part of us that knows.
So knocking on the door instead of the wall.
Oh, yes, you could say that. The other aspect in terms of shifting and reframing this sort of fear-based reality that we're currently in is learning how to care.
Yeah. So can you just remind people what CARE actually stands for?
So CARE is an acronym for Consciously Activated Resonance Energy. So if we seek to consciously activate resonance energy with those around us, with the people in our world, with nature, with the animal kingdom, with the plant kingdom, we can't do that while we're angry. We can't do that while we're holding a grudge. We can't do that while we're holding on to hurt, and past trauma and past issues.
Yeah. And I suspect, the anger and the hurt and the trauma is also keeping us away from our higher selves.
That's correct. So if we look at ourselves as a collective consciousness, then shifting out of fear-based decision-making into care means that we have to work through our past trauma. And then through working through our past trauma, we automatically increase our oscillation frequency and our coherence, which brings us closer to our higher self. And then enables us, it's a bridge that we then build across the self. So it's from the roots, which is the ego-based consciousness, through the self, which is the self-aware human being, into the higher self. And the work then would be to integrate and then maintain this sort of holistic way of being.
Okay, well, I really look forward to finding out more about that. And in the next episode, we are talking about the nature of consciousness.
That's good.
So I look forward to seeing you then.
Fantastic. Thank you.